probably every one of the tens of trillions of cells in your body has its own intrinsic clockwork, that times when it completes different processes each day, such as building new structures or breaking down damaged ones. And for most of us, our body's clock system somehow helps coordinate these pacemakers with each other and with the world around us. In natural settings, like when you go camping, your clocks are tightly synchronized with each other and the world around you. And this mimics the conditions in which our human ancestors probably lived for over 90% of human evolution. When this happens, your body is optimized for physical activity and food intake during the day, and then resting and fasting at night, and you feel and function well. The problem, though, is that most of us aren't off traipsing the Rocky Mountains, and we now live in built environments in which a variety of factors directly and indirectly affect our clocks and can disrupt them. If you want a visceral example of this, try flying 12 time zones to the east and see how you feel. What you might not realize, though, is that most of us experience forms of chronic, low-level clock disruption that subtly but perniciously erode our resilience as the years go by. In fact, it's clear that when an animal's clock doesn't precisely anticipate the 24-hour day, it's bound to live a shorter life and less effectively procreate. All of this has far-reaching implications for how we can live better lives. We can use an understanding of our clockwork to have more energy, sharper brain function, higher physical performance, and better general health during the daytime, as well as higher quality, more restorative sleep at night. Not only that, we can use an understanding of the science to improve medical outcomes, for example, by optimizing the timing of medications and surgeries. We can use it to reduce workplace mishaps and accidents and improve the well-being of workers. We can even use it to bolster the resilience of the biosphere at large, supporting the complex ecosystem webs we're all embedded in, and in turn improving key long-term variables such as food security and biodiversity. At first blush, that might all seem far-fetched, but it's actually not. And my goal for this series of podcasts is to give you a taste of why I fell in love with this science and to show you how you can act on this information to live a better life. We'll cover a lot of ground, and the details of each subject that I touch on could easily fill several books, let alone a few podcasts. But I don't want this to be a deluge of esoteric information that sounds all smart and sciencey, but is actually devoid of practical information and lacks any semblance of what matters in the grand scheme of things. So along the way, I'll pepper this podcast with information that you can actually use to live better. And I'll even add a dash of BS, behavioral science, of course, to help show you ways to seamlessly embed these ideas into your own life. I'm not suggesting that you should be neurotic about meticulously following all of my suggestions all the time. I myself am more neurotic than I'd like to be, and I don't want to use this podcast to create a cascade of contagious neuroses. So if you want to try any of the things that I discuss, maybe just think about making some small changes to your lifestyle step by step, bearing in mind the boring caveat that I'm not a medical doctor. I'm just a nerd that spent far too long at university. So as needed, speak to your own doctor before you make any changes. I also want to be clear that I'm going to focus on the majority of people in this series, namely people who don't work shifts or have circadian rhythm, sleep-wake disorders. Everything that I'll speak about is relevant to these people, but subjects like shift work are very complex, and I'd rather save them for a later date, while also setting the stage for those episodes now so that we can hit the ground running when we later turn to those episodes. Enough rambling from me. The clock's ticking. Do you see what I did there? Sorry. Let's get into it. Since I usually start episodes by asking guests to give brief, practical recommendations, I'm going to do the same here. And I do this because of what's called the serial position effect, which is a psychological phenomenon in which people tend to remember things that come at the start and end of events, respectively, so-called primacy and recency effects. So I'm going to provide some basic advice that's going to work well for most people. And some of my recommendations are based on data from rigorous experiments, but some are just best guesses based on me trying to be reasonable. Starting with sleep, try and maintain a relatively fixed wake time each day. That should happen naturally if you're doing the other things that I'll discuss, but a lot of people sleep in on the weekends, and ideally restrict this to no more than 1 hour of additional sleep on the weekends. Maybe allow 2 if you're very short on sleep. And I would recommend up to 2 if, for example, you have teenagers who have to wake at a time that is very early for their biological clocks before going to school. Don't fixate on when you go to bed as much. Instead, you should only ever go to bed when you're actually sleepy. But again, that time of day should be quite regular if you're following my other tips. Regarding your light exposure, spend at least an hour outdoors in daylight each day. More is often better than that, but obviously you should never get burned. When you're indoors, sit by windows when you can, because the intensity of light that you're exposed to falls exponentially the further you get away from windows. Otherwise, use bright overhead lighting indoors. Think of trying to mimic sunlight. If you're trying to shift your clock earlier, so for example, if you regularly wake to an alarm clock and that curtails your sleep, then aim to get at least 30 minutes outdoors in daylight within 2 hours of waking. Whereas if you're trying to shift your clock later, and this is often true of older adults, you should aim to get at least 30 minutes outdoors in daylight between about 3 hours before your target bedtime and 1 hour before your target bedtime. So if your target bedtime was 10 p.m., then that would be between 7 p.m. and 9 p.m. And if you're trying to shift your clock and therefore your sleep, be physically active at those times of day when you're getting daylight, because that might have some additive effects on the timing of your clock. If you're not trying to shift your clock timing, or if you're trying to shift earlier, definitely reduce your exposure to light in the 3 hours before bed. You want low amber lights at this time. Think of trying to mimic firelight in your indoor environment. So some ways that you could do this would be to use dimmers if you have them. Otherwise, rely on lamps instead of overhead lights. And then during the sleep period, minimize the amount of light that reaches your eyes. For a lot of people, that would just mean closing the curtains. But for some people, that might mean using blackout blinds if they live in a very brightly lit neighborhood, and or using an eye mask. Regarding your physical activity, ideally avoid very strenuous activity in the 1 hour after waking and the 3 hours before bed. And if you have to exercise early, let's say that it's within 3 hours of waking, use a longer warm-up at that time of day because your core body temperature is lower. That will help your performance. The optimal time for performance in most activities is in the late biological afternoon, probably 5 to 6 hours before bed. And that coincides with the end of the working day for most people, which is quite convenient. And then otherwise just sprinkle low to moderate intensity activity throughout the rest of your waking day. A lot of people now are interested in things like cold water immersion and sauna use, so I want to give some guidance regarding thermal stress as well. With respect to cold, it's not for everyone. I think a lot of people assume that it is nowadays because it's become so popular in recent years. But the narratives put forward by many people discussing this subject tend to be very imbalanced and disregard some real risks of cold water immersion in particular. I'll come back to those in a later podcast. But for now, I'll just say that while there's very little research on what the best time of day is for this type of exposure, if you try it, I would avoid doing this within 3 hours of waking in the morning, if possible, and probably also avoid it in the 3 hours before you go to bed at night. And the ideal time might well be in the early afternoon, because that way you get a boost in your alertness, but it's also not so close to bed that it could detrimentally affect your sleep. Regarding heat exposure, I'm personally more bullish about the upsides of sauna use than cold water immersion, but I would still probably avoid it in the 1 hour after waking in the morning and the 4 hours before bed. Theoretically, it could probably be used slightly later than that. The issue is that you need time to rehydrate following high sweat rates while in the sauna. Regarding your nutrition, with respect to your calorie intake, it's really important to maintain a regular eating window each day, which is the time that elapses between when you first consume something that contains a substantial number of calories. Let's just say that's 50 calories. And when you finish your last item each day, the sweet spot for most people, I believe, is an eating window of about 8 to 10 hours, but it can be as short as 6 hours, particularly if you're trying to lose body fat, or if you're on a ketogenic diet and you're trying to accelerate entry into ketosis, or it could be as long as 12 hours, especially if you struggle to maintain your weight or if you're trying to gain weight while still being healthy. Regarding the timing of this window, earlier is generally better, but I'd still wait at least an hour after waking before opening the window. And I'd also definitely look to close it at least 2 hours before bed. Outside of this window, very low calorie items are fine. So things like black tea, green tea, black coffee, sugar-free beverages. If you're a coffee or tea drinker, for example, you should not add milk to those items outside of this window. Next, regarding your carbohydrate and fat intake, I would definitely look to front load your intake within the window in general. The old adage of eating breakfast like a king, lunch like a prince, and dinner like a pauper actually makes a lot of sense for a lot of people. But you should factor in when you're physically active. So if you follow my previous recommendation to exercise in the afternoon, then I think it's fine to distribute much of your carbohydrate and or fat intake around the exercise. This is probably more important for carbohydrate than it is for fat intake, but frankly, we need to better understand that subject because there just hasn't been that much research on it just yet. Protein intake is a bit different. And if you look at how most people distribute their protein intake in countries such as the UK and the US, they tend to have lots of their intake each day at dinner, a modest amount at lunch, and then very little at breakfast. And actually, it's better to evenly spread your intake each day across those meals. I'll come back to why that's the case, but in short, it's to help with things like appetite regulation and knitting together new muscle tissue. So for a lot of people, it makes sense to add some protein in particular to their breakfast and maybe a small amount to lunch too. There are some specific constituents in foods and drinks that can affect your body's clock as well. And one of these is caffeine. For most people, and I'll add that there's huge variation between individuals, capping caffeine intake at no more than about 3 milligrams of caffeine per kilogram of body weight per day is a good place to start. There are resources out there like Caffeine Informer where you can get information about caffeine contents of commonly consumed foods and drinks. To give you an idea, 100 grams of 70% cocoa dark chocolate typically contains about 80 milligrams of caffeine. An 8-ounce instant coffee contains about 50 milligrams, as does a cup of tea of the same size. A shot of espresso contains about 70 milligrams. So a store-bought Americano, which is made with 2 shots, contains about 140 milligrams. An 8-ounce French press contains about 110 milligrams. 8-ounce AeroPress contains probably more like 150 or so. Hopefully that gives you an idea of the quantities and commonly consumed items, but you might want to look further into this subject if it's something you never really thought about previously. And certainly finish consuming your final caffeinated item of the day at least 9 hours before bed. After this time, decaf alternatives are absolutely fine. Another of these constituents is alcohol. It can both disrupt your sleep, but also disrupt your body's clock in many different ways. And I don't want to be a killjoy. I myself like a drink from time to time. So I'll just say, aim to cap your intake at no more than 14 units per week, as per government guidelines in most countries, with no more than 4 on a given day. And this might sound a little bit difficult to pass, but I'd recommend allowing at least 1 hour before bed per unit consumed plus 1 hour. So to give you an example, a pint of beer is typically about 2 units. So 2 units would be 2 hours, but then plus 1 hour, that would be finishing a pint of beer at least 3 hours before bed. If it was 2 pints of beer, that would be 4 units plus 1 hour. So that would be finishing your 2 pints of beer at least 5 hours before bed. And that's to do with the rate at which your body can detoxify alcohol. And then that brings us to fluid in general. There's not much evidence that things like water intake will affect the circadian clock, your biological clocks, but nevertheless, I think it is relevant to sleep, and you should modify your patterns of fluid intake according to your sleep, because obviously you don't want to continuously wake up during the night needing to pee. And in general, I think coinciding your final drink of the day with your final calories of the day is a good starting point, but you might even want to cap your intake earlier than that. And then regarding medications, there are best times of day at which to take certain medications. For example, it seems to be best to take ACE inhibitors, which are commonly used to reduce blood pressure, in the evening. And that's to counter the morning rise in blood pressure we experience each day. Another example is there are various different arthritis drugs that are best taken around bedtime, including some glucocorticoids, and that's in part because of the daily patterns of symptoms that people experience. So ask your doctor if there's a best time of day at which to take the medications that you've been prescribed. That was a huge list of recommendations, and so now you can tune out and go about your day. But being serious, we'll explore the rationale behind each of those recommendations in depth in due course. But at this point, you might still be wondering what these clocks that I'm banging on about are and their associated rhythms. And so let's now turn our attention to these. Biological clocks go way back. To give you an idea of how far back, cyanobacteria, which are the prokaryotic organisms thought to have first oxygenated the Earth's atmosphere in the so-called Great Oxidation event between about 2.5 and 2 billion years ago, actually have their own intrinsic clocks. The emergence of these organisms was enormously consequential because by oxygenating the atmosphere, they allowed aerobic metabolism and the subsequent development of multicellular life. But thinking about our own species' clocks and their relevance, I'm going to borrow a way of thinking about this from a great chronobiologist named Till Roneberg. Think about this. Organisms evolved in the presence of some predictable changes in the environment each day, such as the rising and the setting of the sun. This as the solar clock or the environmental clock. In response to this, biological clocks evolved to predict these environmental cycles each day. And the biological clocks of our distant ancestors were probably closely aligned with the solar clock, meaning they were awake, active, and eating during the daytime and then resting and fasting at night. But while for most of the time that humans have been on Earth, we lived by the solar clock and our biological clocks, that's no longer the case because a momentous change occurred, in particular during the Industrial Revolution. And specifically, maybe the most consequential was the development of the incandescent light bulb. I believe the first light bulb was made by a guy named Humphrey Davy in 1802, but obviously Edison is best known for bringing the light bulb to the masses. And he filed a couple of patents, went on to improve existing electric lights. And then in 1880, the Edison Electric Light Company began making their first commercial electric light bulbs at scale. And as we'll get to, this not only disrupted people's biological clocks, it also enabled waking behaviors, such as eating at times of day when people's clocks were in fact promoting resting and sleep. And maybe most significantly, the emergence of these electric lights enable people to work round the clock. And so our 24/7 shift working society was born. So nowadays, a third clock influences our lives more and more, and that is the social or societal clock, which has enormous consequences for how we feel and function each day. We'll return to that social clock in a later episode, but for now, I just want to zoom in on our biological clocks and why we have these in the first place. We can think of these as having emerged to help organisms anticipate and adapt to cycles in the environment. So regarding anticipation, we have when the sun is up, the so-called photo period, and when it's down, which is called the scoto period. You're probably familiar with the idea that organisms exist in different niches. Obviously, different animals live in different spatial niches. For example, there are aquatic organisms like dolphins. There are terrestrial ones too, like humans. But we also exist in different temporal niches. And we can think of three broad categories of these. So one of them are diurnal or daytime active species, which includes humans. Another is the group of crepuscular species that are most active around twilight, so dawn and dusk respectively. And these include animals like rabbits and deer. And then there are nocturnal species, so things like bats and owls. When you think about these three broad categories, you'll realize that there are rush hours of activity in the animal world around dawn and dusk in which there's substantial crossover between these three distinct categories. And so what our clocks do is they predict when events in the natural world are going to happen each day. For example, dawn. And they set a timetable of events in our bodies to align with these changes in the outside world. Thinking about this through an evolutionary lens, if our bodies were trying to do everything all at once, all the time, then that would be enormously energetically costly. Not only that, having some things always on would be very detrimental too. An example of this that comes to mind is if your immune system was always dialed up, then maybe that could contribute to problems such as autoimmune conditions. And so I'm going to borrow another analogy from Till Ronaberg because I love the way that he frames many different subjects. We can think of wakefulness as being like a Formula One race and sleep as being a bit like a pit stop. In the pit stop happens at a certain time in the 24-hour day or a certain point in the race. During that pit stop, we need to fulfill certain functions. So that's restorative processes in your body. And in the case of the F1 race, that would be things like replacing the tires, filling the tank, and so on. And if we think about the history of evolution, this pit stop has become more complex over time, the same way that as the years have gone by in racing, cars have become more sophisticated. The pit stop has also changed as well. And so now the processes that take place in our body during the pit stop are more varied. And there's a question that has puzzled some scientists for a long time, which is why sleep would have evolved when it doesn't seem superficially to be adaptive in that we can't find resources like food while we're sleeping and we won't procreate and subsequently pass on our genes. But we can think of sleep as being the price that we pay for wakefulness. It's something that optimizes our bodies for things like being physically active, for acquiring food and mate. And so in this way, the clock's ability to anticipate events in the environment and align biology with those events is actually a Darwinian fitness characteristic, by which I mean that if we were active at inappropriate times of day, we might be more likely to run into predators, for example. We might be less likely to find food and mate, and so be more likely to get popped out of the gene pool and less prone to passing on our genes to subsequent generations. While this is quite difficult to demonstrate in humans, there is some evidence suggesting that this is indeed the case. There's a particular type of experiment called a resonance experiment that showed this very nicely. One of the early ones was done by Carl Johnson at Vanderbilt University in 1998. And what they did was they took cyanobacteria that I mentioned earlier, and they grew different strains of these bacteria that have different body clocks. So their clocks tick at different speeds each day. They grew them in dishes under different light-dark cycle lengths. Some of those cycles were longer than others. What they found was that strains that had intrinsic clocks that better matched the light-dark cycle outcompeted the other strains for resources, resulting in larger colonies of these bacteria over time. Subsequently, there has been some work showing this in mammals like ourselves too. Michaela Howe did a really nice experiment in 2016 in which she found that mice with near 24-hour body clocks survived longer and were more likely to reproduce than mice that had very fast clocks as a result of a gene mutation that speeds up the clock. Another characteristic of clocks that's important to understand is that they help us adapt to changes in the environment. We can see this in many ways, but fundamentally, our clocks track the photo period each day. This is what enables us to adjust to jet lag. If our clocks weren't able to adapt, then we'd be stuck in our home time zone all the time, regardless of where we travel to. But a really vivid demonstration of this was shown by Ken Wright and his colleagues. And they published a couple of experiments looking at what happened to the clocks of healthy young adults who went camping for several days at different times of year. So one of these trips took place during the summer and one of them took place during the winter. And before camping, their clocks were similar while at home at these two different times of year. And that's probably largely because of the modern electrically lit light environment. But after just 6 days of winter camping, their biological nighttime started a lot earlier than it did before the trip, and also than it did after summer camping. And then the biological nighttime ended later too. As a result of that, this biological nighttime, and I'll return to exactly what that is later, was about 4 hours longer in the winter than it was in the summer. And so basically, the biological nighttime, the internal representation of the night, expanded in lockstep with the fact that it's dark for longer in the winter than it is during the summer. And then considering this in terms of evolutionary biology, there are certain stresses that can actually potentially cause animals to switch between temporal niches, at least some animals. We don't know that this is true of humans necessarily, but there's been some very interesting research over the years on something called food anticipatory activity. The research on this goes way back. There was some work showing that food consumption can influence the biological clock and food-related behaviors, so things like food seeking, as far back as the 1920s. And they basically found that consistent patterns of activity in anticipation of food availability emerged in rats at times of day when they had food access, but at times of day when, if they had access to food around the clock, they would probably otherwise be inactive and sleeping. And nowadays, there is a lot more rigorously controlled research on the subject than there used to be. And many studies have since shown that restricting food access to the biological nighttime, so the inactive phase, can cause animals such as rodents to shift their activity timing to when they would normally be resting and sleeping. And there are probably a few reasons for that, but a lot of it relates to energy conservation. Obviously, without food, animals would die. So again, this reflects the fact that the clock is flexible and does adapt to changes in the environment in ways that support viability and ultimately reproductive success too. Another subject I want to touch on today is the parameters of biological rhythms. I spoke earlier about how organisms of a species sometimes have slower or faster clocks. This brings up the idea that there's variation within a species in the length of the biological day. And we see this when there are no time cues in the environment. So if an animal is placed in complete darkness and the biological clock continues to be measured for days on end. And interestingly, if you look at the human clock in these types of conditions, it's actually slightly longer than 24 hours. It's about 24 hours and 12 minutes. This internal day length is called the clock's period. Related to this, we have to reset our clocks each day so that we can accurately align them with the 24-hour day. And there is actually a circadian rhythm sleep-wake disorder named non-24-hour sleep-wake rhythm disorder, in which this doesn't take place due to dysfunction in the body's clockwork. And so these people occasionally align with a 24-hour day, but much of the rest of the time they're just drifting later and later across days until after a couple of weeks they're again on time with the light-dark cycle. Another of the parameters of circadian rhythms or biological rhythms that we need to understand is a rhythm's amplitude, which is just the difference between the peak of a rhythm and the trough of a rhythm. So if you look at your core body temperature, for example, it fluctuates by about 0.5 degrees Celsius over the 24-hour day during sleep deprivation. But if someone is allowed to sleep, then the amplitude of the rhythm is slightly larger. It's about 0.8 degrees Celsius instead. And so sleep per se does actually increase the rhythm amplitude. Another rhythmic concept that I'd like you to think about is what's called the phase of a rhythm. And that is the timing of the rhythm relative to some reference point. And so that reference point could be a measure of your body's internal time, such as the lowest point in your core body temperature, which tends to occur about 2 hours before you wake up each morning. Or it could be relative to some point in the external environment, such as dawn. This brings up the subject of chronotypes, which you might have heard about previously. You've probably heard people refer to larks and owls. Sometimes people miss nuances in this particular subject, but to me, chronotype is a quantitative construct. Technically, it's represented by something called phase angle of entrainment. That is basically the relationship between your body's internal time and the external world around you. So, for example, in late chronotypes, so in night owls, the lowest point in the core body temperature rhythm occurs later relative to dawn than it does in early birds or larks. And interestingly, if you look across different species, then humans actually have very large variation between individuals in their chronotype. That might have some relevance to how well we've done as a species in many ways. It's probably particularly relevant to people living in a group living context. There was a hypothesis put forward years ago called the Sentinel hypothesis that's subsequently been supported. And the idea is that if you think about sleeping, you're in this relatively unresponsive state and you could be subject to predators or rival bands of people, for instance. Because of that, this Sentinel hypothesis proposes that in group living settings, it makes sense to share the task of being vigilant, being awake between animals. Some animals will be asleep while others are awake. So there's always a sentinel who's on guard against potential threats. David Sampson and Charles Land did an experiment a few years ago looking at the Hadza people of Tanzania. And this is a group of hunter-gatherer people. And they found that over the 20 days that they looked at people's sleep, at least one person was awake during 99.8% of the time elapsed between the earliest person falling asleep and the latest person waking up. So there was pretty much always somebody awake during this sleep period, keeping guard. So thinking about period, phase, and amplitude, these are relevant to rhythms of all different durations. And this brings us to the fact that your body actually has biological rhythms across many different timescales. You've probably heard of circadian rhythms, and you've heard me talking about the biological daytime and the biological nighttime. And when I'm doing that, I am referring to these circadian rhythms. These rhythms are about a day in duration. They recur roughly every 24 hours. And we have many different types of rhythms. I've touched on core body temperature already, but just as a couple of examples of these, we have rhythmic changes in our body's hormones each day. One of the most pronounced is your body's production of the hormone cortisol. Around the time that you wake up each morning, there's a strong increase in cortisol synthesis. And as a result, a large spike in cortisol production. This is called the cortisol awakening response. And it's one of the reasons that you can get out of bed in the morning. It mobilizes energy from your body stores. It increases blood pressure, it increases psychophysiological arousal. And interestingly, a range of different conditions are characterized by an abnormal rhythm in cortisol each day. You see that in conditions such as insomnia, which shouldn't be a great surprise to anyone. Another of these hormones is melatonin, which we'll return to later. And you might have thought that melatonin is a sleep hormone, but I'd argue that that's not the best way to think about it. You've heard me speak about the biological nighttime. And in humans, this roughly corresponds to when melatonin is being synthesized. So I'd like you to think about melatonin as being a hormone of darkness rather than a sleep hormone. What it does is it basically signals the active period, so when to be awake and running around in nocturnal organisms, although some mouse strains actually lack the ability to synthesize melatonin because they've lost functional genes that encode a couple of the enzymes that are involved in melatonin production. But in humans, obviously, melatonin signals the biological nighttime. So that elevated melatonin coincides with when we should be resting and fasting. Melatonin also has many different roles in metabolism. And this is one of the reasons that I say that it's not just a sleep hormone. And immune regulation too. And some of those effects are actually independent of your body's clockwork. So moving on from circadian rhythms, we also have what are called infradian rhythms. In humans, the most conspicuous of these, and probably the only one of these that we're actually aware of, is the menstrual cycle, which lasts about 28 days. But for some people, it's as short as 21. For others, it can be up to about 35. But some other animals have multiple different infradian rhythms, and they come in different classes. So infradian rhythms are rhythms that last substantially longer than 24 hours. And one class of these rhythms is what's called a circannual rhythm, rhythmic changes in an organism's biology that occur roughly every 365 days. And examples of these would be deer shedding antlers at a similar time each year. Another one of these would be ewes breeding in autumn each year. And interestingly, many of these circannual changes in the biology of other organisms are actually driven by changes in day length and night length, and hence the biological nighttime. So it's the change in melatonin synthesis duration that is influencing some of these changes, such as in reproductive function. And then the shortest rhythms that we have are what are called ultradian rhythms. These are rhythms that occur multiple times every 24-hour day. And there are a few of these, but one of the best known is the stage of different sleep that we cycle through during each bout of overnight sleep. You've probably heard people say that the sleep cycles last 90 minutes. They actually vary quite a lot. And early in the sleep period, they tend to be a bit shorter than that, maybe 70 minutes. But then late in the sleep period, they can be substantially longer. They can be up to about 120 minutes. It's important to recognize too that they're not very neat, because many of us wake up frequently during the night. So it's not like they're perfectly orderly 90-minute cycles that take place like clockwork. And if you do wake up occasionally during the night, I really don't want you to be too concerned about that. Another of these ultradian rhythms is your heart rate. And there are a few more, but I think those will do us for now. Related to this, we can think of these different rhythms across various timescales as being harmonics of each other, which might sound slightly opaque. But what I mean by that is that longer rhythms are actually comprised of shorter rhythms that are superimposed on each other. For example, 24-hour rhythms can actually be broken down into 12-hour rhythms, and then 12-hour rhythms can be broken down into 6-hour rhythms, and 6-hour rhythms can be broken down into 2-hour rhythms, and so on. This type of relationship is seen in some biological rhythms. So, for example, it is evident in your patterns of growth hormone production each day, in that there is a circadian rhythm in growth hormone with peak production of this hormone during the biological nighttime. But within that rhythm, there are also pulsatile changes in growth hormone that occur on these ultradian timescales. And then related to these nested rhythms, there's another concept called timescale invariance that's rarely discussed and not that well studied, but very interesting. The idea here is that some rhythms have the same properties across different timescales, which is a bit like the kinds of fractal patterns that you might have seen when scouring the internet, but also that are evident in nature. And when you look at these fractal patterns, they look very similar whether you're zoomed in close to them or zoomed out away from them. And so an example of this would be looking at the branching of trees. And in resilient organisms that have good health, you tend to see clear timescale invariance in rhythms across various different timescales ranging from minutes to 24 hours. But during aging and some forms of pathology, so for example, Alzheimer's disease, this timescale invariance actually starts to break down, which potentially serves as a biomarker of dysfunction. We'll return to today's subject in just a moment, but before we do, I'm going to be cheeky and ask a small favour. The most popular health podcasts have huge budgets and entire marketing teams behind them. Truth be told, I'm the only person that works on this podcast. I do all the prep, the recording, the editing, the social media, which I do remarkably badly, I admit. All of that takes me about 20 hours of my time each week. But I love this, and I believe in its value, and I want it to become something that ultimately helps millions of people. So if you think this podcast is any good, and if you haven't already, I'd be hugely grateful if you could review it on Apple Podcasts and or share it with people that you care about. And let me know what you think of it. I appreciate all feedback, even if it's just you saying, stop being so bloody long-winded, Greg. Feel free to send me a message on Instagram at Greg Potter PhD with your thoughts on the show. Thanks very much, and let's get back to it. Since we're focusing on circadian rhythms, I want to point out that they're not just all 24-hour fluctuations in your biology, and they actually have some core characteristics that distinguish them from some other 24-hour changes in your biology. One of these is that they're autonomous, they're self-generated, and what this means is that they persist when there aren't any time cues in the environment. This was actually first documented in plants in 1729. A very talented Frenchman named Jean-Jacques Dortu de Mairan put a Mimosa pudica plant in a constantly dark corner of his cupboard, and he documented a daily pattern of leaf movements that continued to occur in the absence of light in the environment. And that suggested that the movements weren't the product of the changes in the light environment, but were instead generated by some internal timekeeping system. Some of the early work showing this in humans was done in caves and bunkers. Famously, starting in the mid-60s, Jürgen Aschoff and Rutger Wever put people in a sun-free environment in a bunker in Bavaria, and they looked at various different candidate time cues to see how they influenced rhythmic changes in things like body temperature and various different hormones and so on in people's urine. And what they found was that, like plants, we have our own internal rhythms or endogenous rhythms. This brings up the subject of what's called masking. And the idea is that sometimes there are time cues that can influence rhythmic changes in biology, but without affecting the actual biological clock itself. So if you think about your core body temperature, for example, then it does have this lovely high amplitude rhythm when somebody is just resting in constant darkness. However, you can also do things that will acutely change your core body temperature. If you go and do a bunch of strenuous physical activity, your core body temperature will rise. Or if you have a large meal, particularly if it's very high in protein, it will rise as well. And so to identify biological rhythms, we actually need to use very precise methods. And I won't go into these, but they include things like constant routine protocols, and we can also use forced desynchrony ones. Another property of these biological rhythms is that they're entrainable. As I mentioned, they're not precisely 24 hours, and so they need to be reset each day. They're reset by these time cues, and the word that's often used for these is Zeitgebers, a German word that just means time givers, roughly. The strongest time cue for your body's clock is the light-dark cycle, and it responds to light according to the spectrum of the light, the intensity of the light, and the timing of the light too. And regarding timing, how your body's clock responds to light can be plotted as what's called a phase response curve, which can be a little bit tricky to describe, but I'll do my best. In some ways, it's similar to a dose response curve, which you might be familiar with. In a dose response curve, the magnitude of your response to something depends on the dose of it. Consume more and more caffeine, and you will feel more and more jittery. In a phase response curve, the response to it doesn't just depend on the dose, but also depends on the timing of the dose relative to your body's clock, which in turn influences whether your clock shifts either forwards or backwards and how much it does so. You can search for a phase response curve online if you like, but they're typically plotted relative to your body's melatonin rhythm because your melatonin rhythm represents your biological daytime and nighttime. But we can also plot it relative to other markers of your body's clock, such as core body temperature. For ease, I'll explain how your body responds to light using the core body temperature rhythm. I mentioned earlier that there's a low point in your rhythm about 2 hours before you wake up. More precisely, it's probably about 2.3 hours on average, 2 hours and 18 minutes. But let's say it's 2 hours for our purposes here. And let's use an example of someone who naturally sleeps from midnight until 8 a.m. This person has their lowest core body temperature at 6 a.m. If you expose yourself to lots of intense light in the 8 hours or so before this low point in the core body temperature rhythm, you'll tend to slow your clock down, shifting it and hence your sleep later. So for example, that would be ideal if you're trying to adjust having flown several time zones to the west. Let's say that you've just flown from the UK to the east coast of America. However, it's not just that anywhere within this 8-hour window you will have the same effect on your clock. And actually, light will most strongly influence the timing of your clock if you're exposed to it about 4 hours before your core body temperature low point. And so for most of us, that would be about 6 hours before we would naturally wake up. Going back to the example of someone sleeping from midnight until 8 a.m., that would be exposing yourself to lots of this type of light at about 2 a.m. That will most substantially shift your clock later and your sleep later too. However, if you expose yourself to lots of intense light in the 8 hours or so after the low point in your core body temperature rhythm, you'll tend to speed up your clock, shifting it and your sleep earlier. This would be very helpful if you've just flown 6 hours to the east and you now have to get up earlier each day and go to bed earlier too. Regarding how to shift your clock in this direction, light will most strongly accelerate your clock if it occurs about 4 hours after your core body temperature low point. So that's typically about 2 hours after you wake up. So returning to our example, that would be getting lots of light at about 10 a.m. While the phase response curve has been best shown for light exposure, there's some preliminary evidence showing that this is relevant to physical activity too. And some scientists have tried to plot a phase response curve for a certain type of exercise. Specifically, Sean Youngstead did a lovely study a few years ago, and going by his research on this subject, if you exercise in the late evening, between about 7 p.m. and 10 p.m. for most people, will tend to delay your clock, slowing it down, shifting your sleep later. Whereas if you exercise in the first half of your waking day, more or less, between about 7 a.m. and 4 p.m. for most people, you tend to speed up your clock, shifting it earlier. Those aren't the only factors that influence the timing of your master clock, but they are probably the best demonstrated ones. It might be that some things like certain medications can have some small influence too. And then the final property that I'll mention is what's called temperature compensation. Some biological processes are strongly affected by temperature each day. A salient example of these is photosynthesis, and that increases with increasing temperatures, but only up to a point, and then it rapidly falls as temperatures rise beyond what's ideal. So if your body's clock was like that, it would speed up with increasing temperatures up to a point, and it would therefore fail to accurately anticipate the timing of events in the world each day that are relevant to reproductive success. So it's important that your body's clockwork is temperature compensated. You've heard me refer to biological clocks many times, and you might be thinking, what's he on about? What are these clocks? It's not like I've got a grandfather clock in each of the cells in my body. So what do you mean? And at this point, I want to pivot to what your body's clockwork actually is and how it works. It's a system of clocks throughout your body. A really helpful analogy is to liken this system to an orchestra. In an orchestra that is aiming to produce a beautiful harmony, we need people playing the right instruments at the right times, at the target tempos, and at appropriate volumes too. And to liken this to the circadian system, playing at the right times means keeping appropriate phase relationships between clocks in this system. Playing at the target tempos means having rhythms with a period, a duration of 24 hours. Playing at the right volumes means having rhythms that have appropriate amplitudes. And when you think about the circadian system, the difficulty, of course, is that you literally have trillions of these orchestral members. And so how do we keep all of these in time? Well, like an orchestra, we have a conductor. And in the circadian system, this conductor is the central clock, which is often referred to as the master clock. And I need to get in some basic neuroscience here. Regarding the central clock, the timing of it is one of the main determinants of when you sleep each 24-hour day. And in a later episode, I'll get to how this clock might largely influence many peripheral clocks elsewhere by gating the timing of other activities to help set the time of those peripheral clocks, because most of us aren't physically active and eating food while we're fast asleep. But the central clock is called the suprachiasmatic nucleus, or nuclei, because technically it's split in two. Supra means above, chiasm means cross. So what this refers to is the fact that this nucleus, which is in the front of the hypothalamus, sits above where the optic nerves cross, the optic chiasm. And the hypothalamus is, of course, a brain region that's important to all sorts of different processes in your body, in particular to homeostasis, to maintaining a relatively constant internal environment. It's key to the regulation of hormones, body temperature, and all sorts of other things that we'll get to in later episodes. But the important thing to understand is that this master clock, the central clock, is mostly set by your patterns of light exposure at the level of your eyes. And it's therefore linked to your eyes. And the key pathway linking your eyes to your central clock is via a specialized type of cell in the eye called intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglion cells. These cells will strongly affect many of the so-called non-visual responses to light. It's these cells that are important to rapidly reducing melatonin production, to shifting the timing of your body's clock. They also influence brain regions that are involved in things like mood and cognition. But for the purpose of today, there are a couple of things to consider. And one of them is that these cells respond differently to different wavelengths of light. As humans, we can see wavelengths between about 380 and 780 nanometers. Light in the lowest end of this range looks violet. Light in the highest end of this range looks red. Other wavelengths outside of this range do affect us. For example, UV light, which is shorter than the lowest of those wavelengths, is best known for causing skin damage. Whereas infrared light, which is above the longest end of the range, can be used therapeutically, as in photobiomodulation. But a key idea is that your body's absorption of light depends on photopigments in matter. And these intrinsically photosensitive cells contain a photopigment named melanopsin, and that maximally absorbs photons with wavelengths of about 480 nanometers, which roughly corresponds to the color of the sky on a clear sunny day, which I'm sure is no coincidence. They are affected by other wavelengths too, and that matters if the light is bright enough, but it's this type of short wavelength light that is most significant for these cells. These cells are also concentrated in the lower part of the retina, and so they tend to absorb light from the upper visual field, which makes sense given where the sun is as we walk around each day. And I'll add that rod cells, which are key to seeing in darkness, and cone cells, which are key to color vision, do influence these intrinsically sensitive retinal ganglion cells too, and the central clock, but only a bit. And for today, I don't think we need to worry about that. So these intrinsically sensitive cells project directly to the central clock. They also project directly and indirectly to other parts of the brain that are involved in things like sleep rate regulation. But the central clock then sends information about light exposure back to the pineal gland, which synthesizes melatonin at appropriate times of day to signal the biological nighttime throughout cells in the rest of the body. So circulating melatonin in the blood then acts on two different types of receptors at cells throughout the rest of your body to signal the biological nighttime and tell cells to engage in appropriate activities for that time of day. And so in that way, you can think of melatonin as being kind of internal time cue. And that makes sense when you consider that many of the cells deep within you aren't really exposed to much light each day. And so we really need that endogenous side GABA, if you will. The master clock also relays information about time of day to clocks elsewhere in the body through some other means. So those include things like projections to other parts of the brain. The master clock actually produces some of its own secretions too that can influence the timing of other clocks. And it's key to the regulation of your daily core body temperature rhythm, which might have some effects on some of these peripheral clocks, and rhythms in hormones such as cortisol, which can also help synchronize some of those clocks elsewhere. So given the importance of these intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglion cells to central clock timing, and many of the other non-visual effects of light too, such as affecting alertness and cognition and mood, plus the fact that the melanopsin in these cells responds most strongly to short wavelength light, there's actually a newly developed international standard compliant way of quantifying the effect of the light that we're exposed to on these specialized cells. And that metric is named the melanopic equivalent daytime illuminance, which I mentioned on the episode with James Hewitt. And basically, since it's these melanopsin containing cells that are key, we need a measurement that accounts for that. And the melanopic equivalent daytime illuminance isn't the same as the photopic equivalent daytime illuminance, which is what most people refer to LUX, which is a unit of light intensity. 1 lux is the intensity of light that's emitted by 1 candle held 1 meter from the eye. Electric lighting, which is very good for letting us see, tends to stimulate these melanopsin-containing cells less at a given level of illuminance than daylight does. That's one of the reasons why it's so important to spend plenty of time outdoors each day. Beside the wavelength of light, though, its spectral composition, the intensity matters too. And going back to lux, the intensity of light in a well-lit office might be around 500 lux. But even in the UK, on a sunny day, around midday, the intensity of light can get up to about 100,000 lux, 200 times brighter than that well-lit office. And while your visual system doesn't respond strongly to that difference, your non-visual system does. And that's one of the reasons that I recommend that you spend at least an hour outdoors in daylight each day. So returning to those recommendations regarding light exposure that I gave at the start, I'll plug a few gaps now. At this point, I want to preemptively field a few questions that some of you might have. One of those is, how do I get more daylight? And a few simple ways would be eat outdoors when you can. At the moment here in the UK, it's the summer, and so that is a real option, although the weather recently has frankly been pretty rubbish. Another is to go for short walks after meals, and you're not only going to benefit from the light exposure then, but also things like the fact that you're being physically active, and that's going to improve your metabolic responses to those meals. And then another would be just park further from some of your destinations. So if you drive into work, for instance, maybe you park a little bit further from your workplace. Another question you might have is, what do I do if I live at a high latitude? And during the long nights of winter, the sun is only up for a couple of hours each day. It's a pretty good question. And in this instance, I would recommend purchasing a SAD light or light box, and definitely get one that emits light at an intensity of at least 2000 lux. And it should contain plenty of short wavelength light. And frankly, most of these types of devices do. I have no affiliation with them, but here in the UK, for instance, there's a company named Lumi that makes good products. If you get one of these, then you want to be within 1 meter of it when you use it. And I wouldn't have it directly in front of myself, but instead just off at a slight angle. Use it for at least 30 minutes each day, but maybe 60 minutes, timed as needed. So returning to what I was saying at the start, you might be trying to shift your clock earlier or later, in which case you can time your use of this appropriately. So using it in the morning if you're trying to shift earlier, or in the evening if you're trying to shift later. And if you have seasonal affective disorder, I would pretty much just follow the same advice that I just gave if you want to try one of these devices, except that the best time for seasonal affective disorder to use these is generally within a couple of hours of waking in the morning. Another question you might have is, what types of light bulbs are best for my home? At night, certainly, you want to use incandescent or warm white bulbs. The lighting should ideally be indirect, dimmable, and it shouldn't flicker. When selecting bulbs, I would look for bulbs that have a color temperature below 3000 Kelvin. Those will contain little short wavelength light, and therefore when you use them at night, you're going to support your ability to get high quality sleep at an appropriate time. Another question you might have is, what about screen time? I've heard that I shouldn't use my phone or iPad or laptop or TV shortly before bed because it's going to wake me up and shift my clock later. Frankly, people tend to make too much of a fuss about this because since your central clock is affected by your recent history of light exposure, if you spend plenty of time outdoors in daylight during the day, small amounts of light at night from these types of devices are going to have negligible effects on your clock and your alertness too. Nevertheless, I do think it makes sense to still dim the settings on these if you can. And if you don't mind them, then you can use certain apps to selectively filter out short wavelength light from these screens. These include things like night shift mode if you have an iPhone, night mode if you have an Android phone. There's a software program named f.lux that I use on my laptop that you can use too, and it just gives the screen an amber hue when the sun is down in your location. And these types of products do reduce the amount of short wavelength light emitted by screens, and theoretically they therefore could be slightly helpful. The problem is that looking at the research, a lot of people don't really like them and they end up just disabling them after a short period of time. But if you don't mind them, and I don't mind them, then there's no harm in using them whatsoever. And then finally, on the subject of light, I just want to mention some of these other non-visual effects of light that I've alluded to. And I do want to address this subject in a lot more detail later. So we'll have a subsequent episode on how light affects other aspects of health. But just to give you some information about some of the other effects of light exposure on your biology, many of these are positive. Getting plenty of daylight seems to help prevent myopia. So it's important to your ability to see clearly and not end up being very short-sighted, as I used to be before I got laser eye surgery. Another is affecting your cognition. There's fascinating work, for instance, showing that you can change office lighting to affect workers' performance. Another is your mood. And if you've ever had seasonal affective disorder, then you'll know firsthand how much light exposure can affect your mood. Another is your hormones, especially your sex hormones. One of the reasons why many of us feel a bit friskier in the summer seems to relate to the fact that we have high levels of certain sex steroids at this time of year in response to greater UV radiation from the sun. Another is your metabolism. There's some preliminary research showing that patterns of light exposure that we get after meals will affect how we respond to those meals in terms of things like blood sugar. And then another is your blood pressure. It seems that getting plenty of daylight might help push down your blood pressure by affecting nitric oxide signaling in your vascular system. And then finally, your exposure to daylight will affect your vitamin D status, which is the subject that tends to get the most headlines. And your vitamin D status is important to things like your bone health, but also your immune function too. The corollary of this, though, is that there are negative effects of excessive exposure to sunlight. One of those is, of course, sun-induced skin damage. And you also get the same type of photoaging at the eye itself. So excessive sun exposure can contribute to some age-related eye problems. Obviously, it's really important that you don't get burned, and that's a good place to start. And unlike some people, I am actually pro-smart use of sun cream or sunscreen. I think that definitely has its place. But variables such as your diet will also affect your susceptibility to damage from the sun's rays. For instance, carotenoids such as lycopene, which is found in abundance in tomatoes, and some other polyphenols, including those that are found in green tea, actually help protect your skin against solar radiation. Another tip, of course, would be to use sunglasses judiciously. If, for example, I go to the beach and I'm outdoors all day, I'll definitely use sunglasses for almost the whole day because I'm exposed to this incredibly intense radiation from the sun for maybe 10 hours within a single day. So there's definitely a place for those when it comes to protecting your eyes against UV damage. You can also wear a cap. That's going to have some effect on blocking the sun reaching your eyes and your face. And if you're concerned about things like skin wrinkling because of photoaging, then a cap will probably help mitigate that to at least to some degree. And the final subject I'm going to touch on today is how your central clock works. I've clarified that it's the light-dark cycle that is the main time cue for this clock. But if we think about the clock itself, what is the timekeeping mechanism? This next part is probably going to be a bit dense and maybe a bit technical. I think it's important to understand because it will help us tee up the next episode on your body's clockwork. Fundamentally, the cells in the central clock are based on what are called transcription, translation, feedback loops. And that might sound like a word salad, but basically these loops produce 24-hour changes in the levels of certain proteins in the cells in the central clock. These proteins then act as what are called transcription factors, meaning that they bind to promoter regions on genes to activate expression of these genes at different times of day. And so what these loops are doing is coordinating the patterns of gene expression within the central clock cells each day. As a result of those fluctuating patterns of gene expression, there are 24-hour rhythmic changes in your biology. And interestingly, there are these 24-hour rhythms in the expression of many different genes in the cells of different tissues in your body. And actually, the genes that are rhythmic in some tissues differ from those that are rhythmic in other tissues. And some tissues have loads of these cycling genes and some don't have so many. But technically, these feedback loops are based on what are called clock genes. In 2017, Jeffrey Hall, Michael Rosbash, and Michael Young won the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine for their work isolating one of these clock genes, the period gene, that represses the main feedback loop. Had they been alive, I think Seymour Benzer and his student Ron Konopka might have won the same prize for their work, which was done prior to the isolation of the period gene. And I'll recommend a brilliant book named Time, Love, Memory that is basically a biography of Seymour Benzer's life. He's an extraordinary person. I'll also add that there's a truly brilliant scientist named Joe Takahashi who's at UT Southwestern, and he's been instrumental in helping us understand some of the other parts of this main feedback loop. In particular, his lab identified another gene that they called clock, which is one of the activators in this main loop that turns on the period gene. And then later on, the period proteins turn off the activating genes, including clock, and the other of those is called BMAL1. The reality is a lot more complicated than what I just said, because apart from gene expression, there are several other layers of circadian control, but I don't want to get carried away. The important thing to understand is that fundamentally, this same clockwork not only exists in the central clock in the brain, but also in almost all of your other peripheral clocks, specifically in all of your peripheral clocks that contain a nucleus. With that, in the next episode, we'll explore the many ways by which these peripheral clocks affect your health, plus what you can do to keep them on time. And I'll flesh out some of the recommendations that I gave at the start of this episode.